Audio. I've been interested in audio really from the beginning of my career in the business. I was doing a disc jockey show in Phoenix when a program director taught me the whole thing about positive push and polarity. And I got to rewire the turntables and things to improve the signal of the station. Got out to LA, and Mike Duro and I started the whole multi-band audio processing for broadcast business. And he went on to become a trillionaire or whatever it is. And I got to go work for Westinghouse. Anyway, um, in those days, modulation was a big deal. Everybody was trying to do 124 and a half over 99 and a half. And then the whole business started to get even worse when dynamic range was being smashed down. And I forget, what was it, Paul? The station in New York had a point 0.8 or a point 0.7 dynamic range.
Oh, I've seen some things.
Okay. So
I've recently seen a radio station in New York running approximately, I'd say 135 to 137%.
that seems to be something else that's going on lately that I've been surprised. I've heard a few stations that are pushing the envelope, let's say. And yet, as Paul's going to explain to us, Paul Kriegler from the Telos Alliance, that doesn't always get you more listeners or even more modulation, does it?
No, no, we'll get into that later about how overmodulation and how it relates to just overall loudness, about how, doing something other than what the radio is expecting is a bad idea. We'll get into that as part of the presentation. It's a short one.
All right, carry on. You've got the,
Can I share my screen?
yes, you can.
Awesome. I will share this one and then I will share this one. We good? I think so. So this presentation, Barry and I were sitting together in Tucson, I guess like 6 weeks ago, and Barry invited me to come back on and talk about the loudness wars being over. And from having been a former program director, I have a bit of a different view on how a radio station might sound. Early in my career, I can't tell you how many engineers would tell me, remember that the radio has a volume knob. And so it's funny, here I am later as a salesperson for Omni and audio processors. I'm going to come back around and, punchline to all of this today is that the radio indeed has a volume knob. Um, so doing some Googling for this presentation just on loudness and on recorded music, um, I was able to bring to the engineering community some graphs that this one obviously displays, I think, in a pretty good fashion, what's happened to popular music. It doesn't matter if it's country, whatever. I'm just talking, this is decade by decade. This is all this is popular music, all music lumped in. Something like 1 million songs were analyzed for this research study. It was done by the Journal of General Internal Medicine, and what they're saying is that this, combined with the earbuds that today's younger kids will stick in their ears, all adds up to hearing loss, and can also add up to bad sounding audio on the radio. But you'll see over decade by decade the level of audio increasing about 1.2 dB. If you're paying attention today as a broadcaster, I would be looking at my streaming efforts and comparing them to the Spotify's and the Pandoras and the YouTubes of the world, just because if you look at their loudness targets, um, And there, you can see anywhere between. So if you're a Spotify user, Spotify is a common one. If you're using Spotify just at a normal level, it's minus 14 loops is their normalization target. If you're using it on loud, it bumps it up about another three, about another three loudness units. Um, and this is important for radio because when you break this, the reason why these loudness targets were selected by the AES is some listening tests were done. And I lifted this from, gosh, where did this come from? I forget which website, who I lifted this from. But from the research they found, looking at, codecs and how these codecs behave, that if you center your loudness at around minus 14, typically they'll tend to start to behave, and you'll hear less artifacts, less metallic beating on the codec. Highs will sound less washed out. Things just start to clean up. Whereas if you really start pushing the loudness and um, come close to clipping in the streaming world, that's when you get all the bad digital artifacts that can happen. And I've done a recent presentation on why streaming has become more important to radio stations because of things like DTS auto stage. I would posit that this 0.9 share that you see here that WFAN had in New York City, this is almost a 1 share in New York on the station's stream, is due to the proliferation of things like DTS auto stage and the fact that stations have more apps. It's much more easier these days for people to stream a radio station in a car. And as streaming, listening goes up and up, and it's much more ubiquitous as DTS auto stage proliferates through more and more car manufacturers. I think it's time for stations to start really starting to pay attention to the fact that loudness targeting and streaming is a really critical thing. Loudness targeting is going to give you an improved sound quality. It gives you a much more consistent experience. I like to loudness target a radio station's library if possible. Makes that easier. Loudness targeting is a good thing in the broadcast plant, simply for one reason: it makes the job easier on the audio processor downstream. So if your automation system has a loudness targeting setting upon ingest based on loudness, not just average level, I suggest using that. Loudness targeting also keeps you in compliance with industry standards. Back to recorded music. This is what, this is the graphical representation, which is pretty ubiquitous online. Just grabbed it. Here it is. What a song looked like in 1979 graphically, 89, 99, 2009, and 2019. Taking a look at today's music, I have a product here called Ulean. It's just a simple online tool where you can upload a song and it looks at the entire WAV file or MP3 file. Will tell you the loudness of the song in short and long-term loudness. I grabbed a song recently that I've heard on the radio. And I listened to it on Spotify and went, wow, that has got to be the loudest song I think I have ever heard. And the average loudness of that track comes in at -5 loops. Most broadcast stations, if you look at the left-right DMOD of broadcast radio stations around the country, I would say the average for, like, let's say a market like Los Angeles would be about -8. So this song clocks in quite a bit louder than broadcast radio would in a lot of markets in the country. A recent song about 5-10 years ago, probably now, by the Congos, about -6 loops loudness, but hits a momentary max of -2.55. That's what the Congo song looks like. And you can see about 15, 20 seconds in, this is an Adobe Audition waveform. You can see that first blast where it goes completely up to the edge. I'm sure that's where it clocks in at -2.55. But if your audio that you're ingesting into your automation system looks like this, anything that you do downstream, wideband AGC, multi-band, you combine all of that together, and then you add a clipper onto that. So my point is this: if you're trying to take a song that's -5 loose on average and hits peaks at -2, and you try to make that on average, like let's say -3, -4, which I've seen in some large markets, you're just making ears bleed. You're just making a tune out happen on your radio stations over the air and stream. This is, what song is this? Yes, this has been the #1 song in the country all stinking summer long. If you've been anywhere near a radio station that plays top 40 music, you've heard this song. And I want you to notice that the overall loudness, the other tracks were at -3, -5. This song is at -9 overall loudness. And I'll tell you why. If you listen to this song, it's very heavy in bass. The bass content is pretty much what drives the song. You could see it on a spectrum analyzer, and it's it's 80% what happens below 100 hertz. And the reason why the overall loudness is lower is the mastering engineers. To get a top 40 song like this to have some bass in it, they've learned that they've got to stop brick wall limiting like how they do in today's country formats and today's contemporary Christian formats. I would say those two formats are formats or styles of music, or probably the loudest offenders as it would be. But I just find it interesting that mastering engineers in Los Angeles have discovered that if they pull back on the loudness of the songs that they're mastering, and make them a little more dynamic, they sound better on streaming services, and they can also sound better on the radio too. Recently, on a trip to New York City, I saw a radio station that was running 135% modulation, and switching from loudness, being too loud on the radio station, as a radio station, that's one subject, but just brute forced overmodulating, thinking as a program director, well, I can just overmodulate, or it's some sort of a competitive advantage to overmodulation. That was a thing. I've seen stations, over my time where, what are they doing? I've got an arrow pointing here to, I believe this is a Nautel transmit. I don't know where I grabbed this from, but it's just an FM envelope, the carrier picture here. And I wouldn't grab a picture. I couldn't grab a picture of what I saw in New York City. But what happens is when the station starts doing 130%, is the carrier starts to just creep right up the HD side bands. I mean, literally any radio, any receiver loses its ability to read that data. You might as well shut the HD off at that point, because what'll end up happening is the HD will work intermittently. It'll just cut in and out, even though you may be, within the station's 70 dBu, you may get a great signal, but why did the HD audio just cut out? The HD audio is going to clip, possibly because you're just clipping the input to the HD encoder. If you're running that loud on your FM over the air composite, and you try to keep up with your HD, you're probably clipping your HD encoder itself. And then if you're running 130, this is just bad. It's just bad one way or the other. That's why I tell broadcasters, really just stick with trying to be in the middle of the market. Turn down your loudness. Quality matters more than ever before. Time spent listening is a great programming weapon, and I've always looked at it as this. As a former program director, I've seen and talked to some program directors who I just don't think they know when to turn things down, or what knob to stop, when to stop. And you could have a radio station that's been around, a heritage radio station, #1, top 5 cum. You could spend in a top market $250,000 a year marketing the thing. You could spend a couple $1 million on billboards, have a $1 million morning show, and some new program director comes in without knowing when to stop, and turns things up way too loud, and you start running listeners off. It can happen. I've seen it happen. It really, to me, it just comes down. My overall rationale still comes down to what's happening around broadcast radio. There are so many good sounding alternatives. You have Deezer now, or is that the uncompressed music service where the music is, the end user, it's linear, um, not even a AAC codec that you have to listen to. I don't mind Spotify. Even having the golden ears that I have, I can tell I don't mind Spotify as long as as long as it's in high quality mode. My picky ears don't seem to matter. But radio's competition really is Spotify or Apple on the dashboard too, and I think those competitors sound really good. And I think radio should step up its game as a result because that's the competition. I don't have anything much new at Omnia to talk about aside from the processor we've been talking about. This is the sales pitch at the end. I'll take questions and we can talk about processing for the rest of the time we're together. But Forza came out at NAB earlier this year. We had the FM version and work continues on it. And it sounds really good. We have a plugin for it that works inside Audio Tools. So if you have Forza on your stream, which a couple large companies do in the US already, you can run Audio Tools and have the same preset from, say, your HD or your stream on your podcasts or anything that you would have on your website as clickable content that may be, a week old, or morning show content that's been forward stored. Forza can be in your streaming hardware. We have a Windows version of it for your stream, part of X20. And this is kind of what the interface looks like. We tried to design an interface that's really simple to drive. And it's really simple for me to give a customer a demo and get going and streaming from within the Zipstream X20 interface. It works with SecureNet. It works with our streaming encoder is top notch. HLS does everything a broadcaster would want in 2024, and then you've got this sound on top of it. It's a real good combination. I recommend Forza. And what questions do we have in the chat, or what comments do we have, Barry?
All right. Well, I'll start, Paul. In our last conversation, not only did you mention that trying to push the stream louder and louder is counterproductive, but many of the new radios that are in cars will react badly if you try to push the modulation of the transmitter. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I wish I had some way to analyze the distortion that could happen. The two data points I have for this, the two main data points I have, one on a visit to Peru, every single radio station in Lima, Peru, city of 9 million people. There are very few rules in Peru in regards to call letters. I think they just say you can have this much power and here's your frequency and go for it. So what I saw when I was down there with my modulation reader was anything between 140 and 160%. Now, so what happens is in any car radio, any Kia, any car radio that I would have gotten in where I would have been the passenger in the back seat, you could clearly tell that the sound of radio itself was suffering through what sounded like just a brick wall of noise distortion. It sounds like fuzz. Makes radio sound fuzzier. So if the whole FM dial, if everybody's doing that, it makes the FM dial itself, it makes the medium itself on any of these new car radios sound like it's been crushed within an inch of its life, just because you were the receivers. I would say pretty much 110, 115% is it. Past that, the software in these dashboards, it turns into distortion. That's what happens. Yeah. I can't measure that distortion, but these don't lie.
One of the things that I thought I understood you to say is that even here in this country, that the modern car radios tend to do a little bit of automatic level control.
So there's two things, and I don't want anybody to mistake that there's one dashboard feature that's been around for a while, and that's if your car speeds up or slows down, the car might have a microphone in it to kind of read how much noise is in the cabin and adjust the radio up or down. That's one feature. That's not what I'm presenting here at the moment. I'll present the story where I was in New York City and one station. I had two stations, one station doing 135%, one station doing 103, 105. Station doing 105% was about 8 dB loud, which is below average for New York City, honestly. The station that was doing 135% loudness on top of Empire was 11.9 dB composite loudness. Now, when I say a station's doing 8 dB composite loudness and the other station's doing 11.9, that pretty much does equate to, yeah, you'd think if you go from one station to another that the other station is going to be about 4 dB brute loudness louder. And if you had a device like what I have, or if you had a modern radio, that would indeed be the case. So here's what happened. When I left Manhattan, I got into a car after taking the train to Jersey. I get into a Hyundai, and the Hyundai, I was in the back seat between two speakers, and the lady driving the car had the radio station tuned to the station that was running, recommended modulation. I don't want to say legal, but certainly recommended, more recommended settings. And she had that station on when I got in the car. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I saw her finger. We got to a stoplight, and I saw her started to fumble through the presets on her dashboard. And I saw her go to the station that I knew for a fact was doing what it was running so loud off of Empire. And I braced myself because I was in between two speakers and it wasn't loud, but I was like, this is something going to get, all uncomfortable sounding. And the radio was nothing. It just, when she switched to the station doing 135%, it was the same. So I know that the cabin experience that a lot of these car manufacturers are considering for, for the end user, for the passengers inside the cabin, it's all part of that to make sure that nothing real jarring happens to the people that are inside the cabin. And that relates to whatever may be coming in from the FM radio too. So if you're using a product like DTS AutoStage, what you're experiencing is the radio itself. My understanding is that it is definitely doing some AGC and leveling to where it is looking ahead for the passengers in the cabin to make sure that nothing happens where it's like something jumps out and scares everybody.
We have a new Kia Telluride, and if I've got the Wi-Fi connected to my smartphone, it actually lowers the digital audio level and caps it off on the phone so that
Correct.
It won't go blaring out into the car.
Yep, I've said that too. I've used that as an example too. That's another in-cabin thing where I can think of many times when I had like a 2008 Honda and I tried to connect my iPhone where I rather ignorantly had my stereo up and I can't hear it, and then suddenly I have no hearing for a few seconds. That can't happen with some of the newer cars. That's taken care of as part of the operating system of the car, I guess I would say.
You mentioned that Apple and Spotify were your picks for good streams.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're ubiquitous. Let's put it that way.
All right. What's your feeling of the streams application that Greg has put out?
For streaming, the audio processing engine along the encoder, what part of it?
Well, obviously it would usually be in a person's telephone, which they would then hook to the car radio, or I don't know if some of the newer car radios might just accept it as an app.
I would have to do some research on what it is. I know Streams was the name of his company, but I did not know that he had a product called Streams. I'd have to do some research on that. So if you're watching, Greg, hi. I'll be doing some research on Streams shortly after this call.
Well, not only Greg, but it's interesting. We often have some FCC folks listening and mentioning 135% mod, but he's not with us today.
Well, it's really a matter of this is real simple. Give the FM radio exactly what it's expecting. That's the best advice I've got. I had one instance where, I know for a fact that broadcasters in some instances have said that they have picked up listenable coverage in areas by using SSB, switching their audio processor to SSB. It was a conversation that was going on around, I would say, sometime around 2014, 2015. And if it works for you, that's great. I have one giant data point that happened to me, and this is one of the neat things that happens with helping customers out, is that you learn, you're there in the trenches with the customer, and you have a program director for a radio station that just had an Omnia 9SG put on their station, and when he looks at you and says, he's a program director friend of mine through friends and known him for a while, and he looks at you straight faced and says, every single radio, my station sounds amazing. I've got people telling me my station has never sounded better, and so on and so forth. But come to my car. What? So we go out to his car. I wasn't going to argue with him. I mean, he acted like he had seen a UFO or a ghost. He was convinced that I had to go out to his car right then and there. We get into his car, and what he was trying to point out to me was there is one chip manufacturer, I believe it's in the Netherlands, that makes chips that you'll find in some Toyotas and in this particular Audi. So we get in the car, and every radio station up and down the dial sounded okay. And then we get to his station, and it sounded like a ghost of the radio station was being broadcast on top of itself, almost as though another frequency was broadcasting the audio about 10 milliseconds behind it, like it was delayed, like there was something in the audio that was just behind itself, like a reflection, the worst multipath you'd ever heard. And then I got my software and I looked at it, called the engineer. I said, when did you turn on SSB in the Omnia 9SG? When did that go? When did that turn on? Because we need to turn it off. We need to go to DSP. We need to provide exactly what I think this radio is expecting. And I think this whole issue will go away for your program director. And we did, and it did. So I don't know what manufacturers have this chipset. I can't pin it down. I have no real, I haven't, I know that there's one, I think it's a chip manufacturer in the Netherlands where this chip is ending up in a lot of the modern cars. So it still comes down to, for me, the piece of advice that I would give any broadcaster: be willing to turn your radio station's audio down. Because if you're playing audio that's mastered at -5 or -6, any attempt to make that louder is bad. So don't be afraid to just turn it down just a little bit, and you might gain some time spent listening.
Thank you. Well, somehow I figured David Bialik was going to have his hand up, and so he does.
So he's here to help me out. Go, please.
Well, first off, you're simplifying some of the loudness on the radios, because not only are people producing the content louder, and then a streamer is normalizing to get stuff softer. if you look at the standards written at AES 77 or TD 1008, there's actually a guideline that they want you to stream at. If it's pop music, probably a -18, and that's in compliance, including with YouTube, Spotify, and a couple of the others are going towards that. And that's standard is being adopted worldwide. Yes, television is at -24, and they've basically accepted that with all of ATSC. If you're analog radio, yes, you're going to be louder. And that's accepted. But if you're going to be broadcasting HD radio, I wouldn't go louder than maybe a -9 or a -10, just because you want to still give it some headroom. And normalization is a major issue. And considering that most interstitials and commercials are being injected from not even your own studio anymore. So I always tell everyone, let's standardize what the interstitials are injecting at. Someone like a Triton was doing, I think they have the ability to standardize it right now at a -18 or a -17. You try to be within that range, because you don't want someone hitting the volume knob before once a commercial starts, because if you're inviting them to touch the volume knob because it's too loud, you're also inviting them to turn it off. You want the listener to keep their hands off the dial. You don't want to invite them to touch it, and that's the main issue. And I also question over processing. Is a 9 too much, an Omnia 9 too much for a stream at that point, because it is pushing so much. I personally like, and I've said it to Frank, and Frank agreed with me at times. I think the Omnia 3 actually sounds better on a stream if set up properly. And that's why when we designed the R2, he had the option for the Omnia 9, but we standardized on the Omnia 3 that was built in.
We have a lot of streamers that would take you to task for the statement about Omnia 3 band sounding better than Omnia 9.
Of course you will, but and it's processing, as I've always said, is a preference.
Mm-hmm.
But no one will take me to task that if interstitials are being broadcast in too loud, and then the content is not equaling, you don't want to be at a different level than your competitors, and you don't want to be at a different level than your interstitials being, because just touching the volume knob is dangerous to your TS.
That is one feature that's in Forza's. We do have the 1770 limiter that can be turned on or turned off. I typically turn it off and listen to a radio station's programming content over a longer period of time myself, and set a final limiting or loudness target for the station, depending on the encoder myself. I don't really use that strict loudness targeting, although I do definitely keep a station's final loudness target around -13, -14, right around that for most commercial broadcasters.
For a stream, that's still too loud.
Well, so I could point you to several broadcasters, David, and that have to compete in a world where they've got major content providers, who I'm not going to name, that are at -9 and -10.
Oh, I know that. Granted, the standard is only what is it now? Maybe 15 or 16 months old, but it was accepted by everybody, and everybody had the privilege to comment, and everybody seemed to come to agreement. Granted, it's going to be an evolutionary adoption, and I challenge anybody whenever I'm setting up a station. I said, let's play something that we can all agree upon. I usually choose something like some of the Ronstadt productions because, let's face it, a female voice shows more than a male voice, and they were mixed right. That you can, if you can hear the cymbals, if you can hear all the harmonics of the instruments, you're doing it right. And you got to trust your ears and not just go for loudness. And people will react because the loudness war was based on the old analog tuners of the radios where you were going down a string in a wheel and you would stop at what's ever loud. You're not doing that anymore because in a stream now you're on a destination. You're dialing.
You're the
what you
same
want.
button on the dashboard with Apple or Spotify. It takes the same amount of pressure from a finger to press your radio station as it does to press Apple or Spotify or whatever other content they want to access while they're behind the wheel now these days.
Yes, I agree, and I also speaking about Greg's app, the Streams app, he is favoring the AAC while everybody else's app is still favoring MP3, and you can hear the difference.
Streams.
HLS is a good thing for Greg too.
I believe he's actually favoring the HEAAC because you can hear the difference. It's wonderful.
Got one of our customers using Omnia 9 across the entire platform and their 30 spoken word streams as well. And for them, feeding HLS, they love Omnia 9. And I've got to say that their streams are some of the best I've heard with using my company stuff. Love the HLS setup with our Zipstream products.
Okay. Anyone else have a question or comment for Paul? I think
somebody here that says we're talking about the Saturday Night Live Garrett Michaels, where he's constantly reading the sports, or was it the sports where he's constantly talking on Saturday Night Live like this? Yes, you don't want to scream at your listeners all the time.
and that was for the deaf, or supposedly.
Yes, for the deaf. Yeah.
ASL.
I'm sitting here splashing myself with holy water, listening to all of this heresy. You want to crank it down?
Yeah. Well, the music that you're getting today, if you're a broadcaster, your Luke Bryan song is mastered at -5 or -6. And really, to sum it up, you can try to make that louder, but if you do, bad things happen. So,
well, if you're around New York in the days of WPLJ, before it went to heaven, that was incredible. It was as loudest on the dial. It just smashed and mashed like crazy.
Oh, it was that way up until I'd say it might still be that way today, but no. 4 years ago, it was really bad when it was 2019 when I was in the New York vicinity, when it was really just a wall of hash. The whole market to me sounded like a wall of hash.
Right.
Just a wall of noise. And you talk to an audiologist. I have spoken to an audiologist because I've had my hearing tested. And she says, if I showed her like on my phone, I'm like, what does this look like to you? If this is like, the waveform of audio, she's like, that looks like noise. That looks like a tone. That looks like something that it doesn't resemble any sort of waveform. That's what she said. So that's what this stuff looks like when under a microscope.
So what do stations have to deal with, with the stuff that's mastered today, just right up to the edge?
To deal with it, stations they can normalize their library so that a song that is, that has a loudness average of around -12 or -13, like one of the songs from the 70s where you can clearly see the waveform has some dynamic range in it. In my automation system, I would make sure if you're a jack station where you might be playing Aretha Franklin, think up next to pick a Taylor Swift song or pick a song from The Weeknd or Bruno Mars or something like that. You could, find quite a few stations around the country that are pulling 5 and 6 shares with, a variety hits format where they're playing 1,000 songs like that. Now, the problem in the library with the audio processor becomes how do you, get all that together? And one, loudness targeting in your library would be the one. One thing I would do. The other one would be I would make sure I have a processor from ours with the declipping feature in it, either a 9 or an 11. You've got the perfect declipper that in the 9 it's called undo, and the Omni 11 it's called perfect declipper. It's a feature that was added about 7 years ago, 8 years ago to an Omni 11, and it absolutely provides a little more air to the radio, to the harsh music that you might be programming on your station. The other thing you could do is from a strict technical standpoint, going back to when I was a program director or an operations manager, and I knew before me there would be one person in the building that was responsible for dubbing all the spots, music. They were meticulous. They might use white gloves. They cleaned the tape heads all day long. They took great care about how that station sounded. So basically, everything that was carded on that radio station was filtered through one person's sensibilities, whether it was music or spots. And that's kind of what's missing today. So that's kind of why the normalization that I'm talking about feature needs to be implemented by radio stations, because they don't know that kind of hand on a fader and dubbing in ingest of your library is a critical part of this. So back to what we're talking about, declipping, I would use a perfect declipping algorithm, perhaps. If I'm stuck with an Omnia 6 for another 8 years until the wheels fall off of it or it just croaks in the rack, and I have no possibility of getting an audio processor that's been designed, made, or manufactured in the last 15 years, I would perhaps go so far as to try to redub my music station's library and use declipping on each song and re-ingest the music, because it can make that much of a difference in the fatigue factor of your station's overall sound. If today's modern songs from country and CCM artists and a lot of rock, it's going to be produced like where it's just brute force clip like that. These are kind of the steps that you can take.
It's funny, in the old days, it was trying to make the jukebox as loud as they possibly could.
Well, it's the loudness wars were fun while they lasted. Raspberries Go All the Way was probably the loudest pop master, in 1972, I think it was. I'm showing my age. This is why I have no hair. But that was a real record-setting song at the time. If you go back and listen to that song, it sounded like it was fed through one LA4 limiter after another LA4 limiter after a third, then maybe a fourth.
On the countryside, there was a record, Little Arrows by Leapy Lee. And that record, from the time that it started till the time that it ended, the view meter did not move.
Yeah. Yeah. The loudness wars really started over again because of one thing. And the story that I've heard handed off to me when I was a program director, I heard this from people that worked in the record labels. Somebody told me that it was Clive Davis from Arista who was probably responsible for a good deal of what happened to the loudness of masters at one point. But he would go from CD to CD. What we would do sometimes as program directors, comparing my station with the other guy and the other guy, Clive Davis would do that with his Whitney Houston record versus whatever else was out at the moment, and he would go sit there and go between, have CD players and go between them and see how loud each song was or each master was. And the fact that we could look ahead, limit. I know our audio processors, ours Omnias, especially the old 6, the veritable Omnia 6, the HD version of that, I know was used to master some CDs. I knew one mastering plant had an Omnia 6 and an Aphex 2020 that they use for mastering different things. I don't know if it was used on Pop Masters or Rock or whatever, but I know that there were mastering places that use broadcast type limiters to get that beefy sound.
Well, there's always that push to find the new clue. I saw the D clipper that Leif came up with when he first brought it out in his what became the Omnia 9, and like everything else, you can use it or you can overuse it, and that's the problem, isn't it? That we have this marvelous transmission ability today, and so many of the car radios are so much better than they were 30 years ago.
Well, transmitters have come a long way. Exciters from the first generation digital exciters that we had, those have come so far. Today's modern exciters sound amazing. Today's modern processors sound amazing compared to the first generation. I mean, we've come so far, yes. And so it is a shame that in the face of us being able to generate a greater resolution in audio on the air, most of it is because of the producers and the record labels and their choice to just keep making things louder and louder. And there is somebody that has posted about the clipopotamus in the message board, and I'm going to be in Minneapolis, and I can't wait to hear the clipopotamus on the air. You need to go to the message thread of this call and see the YouTube video what I'm talking about. I'll be sure that I put the Omnia 11 and take the patch point out and feed that into the clipopotamus. It's going to sound great. It's going to sound amazing. I love the clipopotamus. It's my favorite clipper in the world.
Interesting. Now, about total modulation, I'll just pick this one out one more time. There was a famous SBE meeting in, I think, Philadelphia, when Arno Meyer showed the actual modulation levels of a number of stations, and apparently one of the local field agents got wind of it and created some issues. But I also know that in certain companies, there are people that say, I will give you a bonus if you get a modulation violation.
So when I worked for Clear Channel, there was a certain Randy Michaels from the J-Core days when he was still in the company. I think you're referring to Randy Michaels, and that hasn't been confirmed. And I won't deny it here that he ever did that. I can't say that he did or didn't, but that was a long time ago.
I'm not going to tell.
But
But
every broadcaster knows the meter needles have to be pinned.
So I have a really good friend of mine that I consider him one of the smarter program directors in the country that I've talked to in this job. One of the things I like is as a former program director, I get to sometimes talk to PDs or an OM. Doesn't always happen, but sometimes one in a bigger market will reach out to you with some really smart questions. And he had some really good questions, salient questions about audio processing and watermarking and time spent listening and his format, which was country. And he was painfully aware of what today's country music sounds like. And his goal was to try to take his massive cume and increase time spent listening. And I said, you've got one way to do that. That's at your fingertips with a new processor that your company just bought for you. And it's with an Omnia 9. I would turn it down. I would make your average loudness of your song on your station about 6.5 dB composite loudness, maybe 6.9. I'd keep it under 7 because the whole Denver market is up at like 8.5, 8.2. It's a very loud, dense market. Some markets are loud and open. Some markets are just dense. And Denver's both. Denver's loud and dense. So woo. But his station sticks out like a sore thumb because it is the least loud radio station. And when you listen to the commercial stop sets, you don't hear things like vocal fry on spots that have been sent over by an ad agency, where you might have a female voice, and every single time she says something you get this like ripping and tearing sound. No, processor's got everything in check. It's turned down. It sounds really good there in that market, and he's just kept being more number oneer and more number oneer. So I think that strategy worked for him.
So I can't figure out how to raise my hand, but now there's a break. So, speaking of record libraries and such, I'm sure Minnetonka has a normalizer. What else is out there? What might be available? I mean, my particular problem is my own music library. Everything's been ripped. High bit rate MP3s, 320 kilobits per second, so the quality's there. But I
that's
don't
not
like
good.
using the volume.
Yeah, I wouldn't start with any audio for your stream. So here's the problem. What I would tell any broadcaster
No, this isn't for streaming. This is for listening.
Oh, this is just for listening. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm
Okay.
sick and tired of having, I know normalization exists. Don't want to spend a lot of money, but the
there's-
quality's there because I'm not going to be recoding it. It's 320.
I think FooBar will do loudness normalization. I think there's software that'll
I've
do
been meaning to
this.
ask Corny. It's on my list next time I talk to him and see what he thinks, but I figured I'd get your opinion.
I know there's DB Power Amp, I think would do it.
And which of those have declipping, if any?
So you would have to run declipping if you're going to do that. Like what I suggested earlier, that would have to be a VST plugin that you would host in Adobe Audition or something like that. You would have to run. You would have to do that in a batch fashion in Adobe or something like that. Hang on 1 second. I'm doing a quick Adobe Media Encoder, Reaper, Audacity, FooBar 2000. That's what I thought. FooBar 2000 makes it easy.
Okay. Well, easy sounds good because it's a pretty big library.
So if you're a broadcaster, I know there are automation systems like Zeta has. You can set your loudness targeting for 3 different voice tracks, spots, music separately. You can set different loudness targets, and I would just set them all the same. If I was going to do, if I wouldn't set any of those, I would set it. Yeah, Wide Orbit has an ability to, from the audio editor, to import a song and then normalize it based on average loudness. It's not doing it based on the peak level.
Right, which of course, that's good.
Yeah,
requires more smarts, but peak level. That's what we used to do on cassettes, but
I think Thimeo has a tool that will do loudness normalization. WatchCat, I believe, is what it's called. It's pretty inexpensive software.
A lot of very knowledgeable people.
Oh, at Thimeo, yes. Yep, I know Hans very well. We're good friends. That's a product that would work real well for normalization. We do have audio tools which do the same thing, but that's what comes to the top of my mind. Hopefully that points you in the right direction.
thank you.
Sure.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes here. I'm sure Paul has got to run before too long.
There's one comment from John. One problem involves outside turnkey format providers. We used a hot AC format provider for years that had noticeable difference between comparable cuts. Yeah, when the provider is sending that to you, it is kind of hard to deal with that because a processor, absolutely, any processor likes to be hit within a sweet spot. When the audio is varying that much, it kind of makes it a little bit harder. Wow. I won't ask you, John, to name who it was. I'd be curious though.
I won't say who it is, but I will say that we did change our source of providers, and the new provider is much more consistent than the old.
So was the previous provider where you've got audio playing out of your own automation system and they provide the logs, or was this all coming over satellite or IP?
I probably shouldn't. I probably should take the fifth on that because that might betray who's who. But
Okay, fair enough.
we'll say that it would be a nuisance for us, the affiliate, to be able to change it, and so we, the affiliate, did not.
Sure.
Anyone else have a comment or a question for Paul? Could be on modulation, could be on audio processing, could be on being a program director and trying to wage your way through the air people.
1, 2, 3, 4, 3. It's been 8 years since I've been a program director, so it's still in my blood. I'll warn you, it's still kind of there.
Paul, what about declipping on like an oldies, excuse me, an oldies library?
Unnecessary. So the one thing I would steer clear of, and I'm glad you asked because I was an oldies program director, and there's a couple things that happen with oldies libraries and transfers. A lot of songs, whether you know it or not, need to be time corrected, because what will happen is the tape stretches from the time that it's been stored to whenever they're rolling it back and making the A to D transfer. That's my dog, sorry. And what happens is you'll end up with some of the early A to D record label transfers. Somebody pointed this out to me where they'll play back 1.5% to 2.5% louder. Then hang on, be right back. Hang on one second. Sorry about that. You're gonna hear my dog bark some more. But yeah, so I do have a friend of mine. He's got a company called MSA Oldies, where you can source songs that have been meticulously saved as WAV files. I just don't recommend that any broadcaster use something that's like Q sound. If you can avoid anything that's been mastered using Q sound, if you grab like some of the Capitol remasters, they'll say Q sound on the back. And those do something really squirrely with the L-R, and I don't recommend that at all. It'll make your station sound real washed out when those songs play in mono.
Of course, for some of us that are a little older, I won't point the finger at you, but having listened to some of these on the air, knowing that certain stations sped the turntables up in the first place, and the songs did not sound the same on CD, you have to kind of pick a choice there between the tape readjustment and the CD.
Yeah, I just would start with
if the tape is stretched, you're going to be slowing the audio.
Right. There are certain versions of songs that are oldies where you want to play the right version of the song. A few of them aren't coming to mind, but there's a few edits and there's a few here and there where the radio version would have been different than the album version per se. Steppenwolf is one that comes to mind for the late 60s of all things. But that mono version that got played on the radio was vastly different than the album version, which was a completely re-recorded version. And if you're an oldie station, you're really trying to bring back the feelings of those songs as they were first heard by the end users. I think a radio station that takes that little extra step has that little bit of advantage, because you're messing with somebody's memories. So you want to be particular about what versions you play. There was a program director I worked with inside Clear Channel, Bill Cahill, from the Washington, D.C. area. He was great at knowing, he had the correct versions. He had, a mountain of research with him. He was an advocate for the oldies format and hated when radio stations got rid of that word oldies. Hated it.
If I could interject really quickly, Bernie Grunman, who is the mastering engineer, he would EQ a mono record for an AM station differently than he would EQ a stereo record for an FM station. Yeah, because he wanted the record to sound right on an AM radio station. So, it goes clear back to the record company too.
They've stopped doing radio mixes. So they will do mixes a lot of times. They'll do a dance mix maybe, or they'll do
Right.
a language edit and mixes like that. But the days where somebody would come along and go, we need to make the mid-range or the vocal more dense in the mid-range or something to make this song pop out a little bit more on AM radio or on FM. Those days, that ship sailed because it's so
gone.
different. Yeah.
But it also contributed to that sound that we remember on AM.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. 100%.
Yeah.
It was a style thing. It was the sound. It was how modern music, sounded.
And if you have a big enough check, I'm sure that Bernie is more than happy to remaster your library.
I just find all this talking, all this sound is so subjective. I mean, look at us, we're all old guys and our hearing's not as good as it used to be, and it maybe never was if you were a roadie. But I find it interesting.
Sound is very subjective. As a former program director, audio comes down to one thing for me as a former PD. I'm going to talk passionately from a place about audio processing, and it comes down to it's the equivalent of mood lighting. So if I'm starting with garbage, like a garbage remaster, we're going to go back to the oldies format, because I struggled finding source material for that format that hadn't been remastered. I had to be particular about it because I don't want an Elton John song to come out like Garrett Michaels from Saturday Night Live, where Elton John is screaming at me, and then the next song plays from Hall & Oates and it sounds pristine on my radio station. What was with that Elton John song? What did Elton John just do to my radio station? So those sorts of remasters and ferreting those out was something that as a program director, I took the time for, and it's not something that a lot of program directors do. That's probably one of the reasons why I'm working for a company like Omnia, where I'm working as a vendor in the audio processing range and with audio, is because I was what some engineers called either a pain in the ass behind my back or I had dog ears.
So, I mean, looking at the state of home radios today.
Yeah.
And so
so home radios aren't really, so you can't go to a retail shop and go find a home radio for me and come back.
I agree with you. So basically you're processing for the car.
Correct. That's my advice to broadcasters. That's what this whole presentation is about, is really what it comes down to is in the car. What radio has left, as a former program director, I'm here to tell you from looking at Nielsen, and these reports and this data isn't anything that's brand new for where things are going for broadcasters. Broadcasters still have the advantage on the dashboard. That's where radio's advantage plays to. And if you want to, still have, if you want to perform well in the household, that comes down more to HD. There's very few radios that are made anymore that's going to get, or your radio station inside a lot of concrete buildings, just the way it is today with the interference with radios and things like that. So this is where I'm going with this, is it comes back to the stream. It really does. Streaming's going to, if it's if it's 14% of radio listening today, it's going to be 20%. It's going to be a quarter of it by the year 2028, probably in another 4 years.
My situation is a little different than you lower 48 guys, so we still have a good AM radio station. Of course, it helps that we're the only signal around. I do run FM and HD here in Kotzebue, but everything else is out in the country, and we probably have a larger listening audience in Russia than on our side. So
fascinating.
AM radio is still important. Try to buy a decent AM radio is like crazy.
I'm a big fan of AM radio. It's how I cut my teeth. When I had a pirate station in my parents' basement when I was a kid, not only did I had to have an FM 10-watt kit, I had to try to have some sort of AM version of it. I had to have an AM FM pirate station, right? Come to find out, carrier current was a lot harder than it looked.
Now, are you suggesting that the KTEL versions are not the best?
No. Those just don't do 125% modulation like the DX50 or something like that.
I was going to ask you how you got on with your engineers, but you pretty much covered that part of it.
Yeah, really well, mostly. Troy Langham is still one of the top bananas at Clear Channel, iHeart, sorry, in Tulsa. Steve Smith, I think he's almost retired, but Troy's still there doing a lot of work for that company.
Good guy. Good guy.
Great company, super smart. I encountered Troy as a program director in 1994 when I made a stop in Tulsa, and I was there for 3 or 4 years. Troy was fantastic. I learned a lot about audio processing from Troy. And I just learned a lot from asking questions from engineers.
To bring this thing full circle, let me toss this one at you for your comment.
Sure.
This goes back 40 years or so. Had a program director come into town here, and I thought I had a pretty sweet sounding radio station. But there's always room for improvement. So one evening, I agreed to go out to the transmitter, and he's driving around in his T-Bird and calling me from payphones around this. Yeah, there were payphones in those days. It was before cell phones. Anyway, he'd call me and he'd tell me, he says, "No, turn up the bass more. Turn up the bass more." And each of the times he did that, I'd actually turn it down a little bit. And the next time he would call, he says, "It's sounding better. It's sounding better. Turn that up just a little bit more, a little more." And I turn it down a little bit. And finally, we got to a point where we knew we weren't going to go much further because your ears just don't become elastic that long. And he says, "What did you do? How did you make this thing work?" And I said, "Rich, the answer is less is more."
Yeah. Yeah, as a former program director, there's a density that I always tried to avoid. I'd never wanted my station to sound dense. I always wanted it to have more of an open sound. And the phrase that I use to describe it is called, I guess would be called apparent dynamic range, where there is some apparent, dynamic range in the broadcast where, the ear has something to grab onto. As you approach such a narrow dynamic range in recorded music, I do believe the ear gets confused and the ear gets fatigued. And this is all subjective. Again, it comes back to, like what you said, it is crazy to talk about stuff like this, but there was a company called Cox. They're still around. They're owned by Apollo these days, but they were a very research heavy driven company. And this comes from a general manager that I worked with, who worked for Cox for a long time, back when Bob Neal was the programming czar for Cox radio. And they did research on everything. They took no stone was left unturned if you were a Cox station. They would research anything, and then whatever they researched, they would research it again to make sure that the first batch of research, the second and the first batch, they relied heavily on research. They researched sound. And what I was told they came to the conclusion of was that women don't like stations that are real bass heavy and distorted. That was what I was told was the research finding. And I'm like, that's interesting. I would think that in terms of audio and distortion, that it would be, crunchy highs that would drive a woman more be out to upset a woman's ears, just based upon the fact that I do think that they hear better than men. That's been sort of proven.
They don't like the thud as well as some young guys do.
Yeah, that was what they found in the research.
Chris Anderson says, "One may talk about streaming in vehicles, yet know many of the youths who cannot connect their phones via Bluetooth. I see them all the time holding their phones."
I know.
It's
I don't know.
the new transistor radio.
Yeah, I don't know a single person though that's not like, if this car doesn't have CarPlay, so help me God, I'm not going to own it. That's my world.
It's getting easier. I mean, I changed phones, and now you have to go back into many of these cars and get rid of the old phone and put the new phone in. And they don't make that as easy as they could, but it's getting easier.
Right. So with the DTS Auto Stage app, if you're a broadcaster, what they've got going on, and DTS is owned by Xperi, has nothing to do with Telos. Did a presentation with you on this back in, I think it was February, Barry, but long story short, Xperi has a product for the dashboard called DTS Auto Stage, and broadcasters can take advantage of this by sharing their metadata with Xperi, and you might have to be patient to email them or get through to them or to join this. You don't have to be in HD to take advantage of this. But you give them your logo, your metadata, and your station would show up on their dashboard. So if somebody's listening to your station, they could lock it there. And with the new software that's in these cars and the connectivity ability with the car, somebody could drive out of your coverage area and the radio would sync the stream so that when you drive out of the coverage area, it just goes to the stream and you don't really notice that you've left the coverage area of the radio station. So you could theoretically keep somebody coast to coast like satellite radio can.
Robert wants to know, did you like the 94.7, the wave sound?
The wave sound. Where's this? In Los Angeles?
Robert?
Yeah, they're still on the air, but they're not the same format anymore.
Oh yeah. I don't think I ever heard it. I don't think I ever heard that station. That was a smooth jazz station in Los Angeles, right?
Yes.
Oh,
ATWV.
never heard it. I have a least favorite station in Los Angeles processing wise. It used to be. They fixed it, so it's no longer my least favorite in the country. But I'm trying to think of somebody in LA that I've heard where I really like the sound of it. Power 106. For that type of format, I thought sounded really good when I was in Los Angeles 3-4 years ago. I thought the Cumulus KLOS, KLOS sounded pretty good for my friend Keith Cunningham is the PD there. I thought KLOS sounded pretty good.
Well, Paul, I could listen to your stories for hours.
Oh, thanks. I'll get Frank here. You guys could talk for days.
That would be good, and we could talk trains and audio.
Yes.
But sure appreciate your coming. I like I say, I'd like to have you come back periodically, and hopefully next time drag Frank along and talk more radio processing and even streaming processing, because it's so important these days.
It is important. It's going to become increasingly more and more and more important. I see companies reinvesting in their streams. I've seen companies, go the way of, where they have reinvested in their streaming efforts or doubled down on their streaming efforts to increase the bandwidth, to increase their audio processing capabilities and quality, to get more resolution to that end user wherever they're at in their car. If they're on low bandwidth, it's kind of where we are today. HLS is what I tell broadcasters. Somebody came to me at the TAB and they said, best advice if I'm streaming, it's HLS. Use a zip streaming encoder and do HLS.
Probably.
Sorry?
I was going to say probably the big factor is going to be whether they streamers learn not to run 10 spots in a row.
Stream only stations are doing that?
No.
Oh.
No. But broadcasters who go streaming seem to think that's the way to go.
Well, as a former program director for 96 Rock in Atlanta, the old WKLS, may it rest in peace, I remember a point in time where we ran 19 minutes an hour in morning drive.
You remember pirate radio in LA? Scott Shannon?
So that was about the time when I was cutting my teeth in radio. Yes, I do.
And they tried to run 2 minutes an hour and make it work.
I have seen radio stations, make that a centerpiece of what they're doing. One of them was in Seattle. I think Intercom took that as a programming tact for a while, where they would do, they would say you're never more than 2 minutes away from getting back to the music or whatnot. They split up their stop sets differently and really capped their inventory loads. I think it is like 8 or 10 units total, and it made a difference in ratings.
Yep, it would. It would.
When I was a program director, there was a research guy. His name was Don Davis. He had a company called Momentum. It was like broadcast architecture, where Don used dials. He had a whole dial system that he would take with him, set up in an auditorium, and Don would do your music testing, and you'd have everything on a silver platter the next day. And we could test all kinds of things, music libraries and stuff like that. I miss those days.
Yep. That was fun. That's when radio was fun.
That was when radio was fun.
Well, thanks again.
Good. Thanks again, Barry. Any questions, let me know. I'm always here, paul.kriegler@telosalliance.com. And I'll see you soon, Barry.
Excellent.
Thanks, guys.